what do we know about James, the half-brother of Christ? Well, here are a few things. We know he was the half-brother of Jesus. In other words, Mary and Joseph, Mary after the virgin birth, had a normal marital relationship with Joseph, and they had other children. These other children are Christ's half-brothers. They're mentioned in Matthew 12, verses 46 through 50, Matthew 13, verse 55, many other places. And so James was one of these, which is interesting because the Bible flatly contradicts the Roman Catholic idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Obviously, Mary was a virgin at the time of Christ's birth, but she did not stay her whole life as a virgin, or else where did these other half-brothers of Jesus come from? James is probably the eldest of these half-brothers, because when they're mentioned together, they're mentioned in different places in the New Testament. James is typically mentioned first. As I mentioned before, when you look at John chapter 7, verse 5, Christ's half-brothers had a hard time initially believing that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't know if I could fault him too much for that. What if your brother claimed he was the Messiah? That would be a kind of a hard pill to swallow. So they didn't even believe in him early on. But post-resurrection, it seems that they did believe in him. James, the half-brother of Christ, was one of the first to receive the news that Jesus, in fact, had resurrected from the dead. John 20, verse 17. James, the half-brother of Christ, you can remember from what we cited earlier, Acts 1, verse 14, was part of the post-resurrection ministry of our Lord Jesus Christ. James, the half-brother of Christ, was definitely a believer after the resurrection. There's a reference to that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7. And then James, the half-brother of Christ, rose to a position of great responsibility and authority within the church at Jerusalem, the very first Christian church. For example, Peter wanted James to know about his miraculous escape from prison, Acts 12:17. Paul visited James, the half-brother of Christ, Galatians 1:18 and 19. James, the half-brother of Christ, became a pillar in the early church, Galatians 2, verse 9. When the Judaizers, legalists, came to town, they tried to connect themselves, to give themselves authority to James, the half-brother of Christ, Galatians 2, verse 12. James, as I mentioned earlier, James, the half-brother of Christ, is one of the presenters or speakers at the famous council at Jerusalem, Acts chapter 15. James, the half-brother of Christ, also tried to, or was successful in telling Paul, you've got to go back under the law, not for purposes of justification or sanctification, but so as to not be an offense to the Jews. You'll find that in Acts 21, verses 18 through 26. And then finally, James, the half-brother of Christ, is alluded to by his brother Jude to give authority to Jude's book, Jude verse 1. So all of that to say that following the resurrection of Jesus and James becoming a believer in Jesus as the Messiah, he became very prominent in the early church in Jerusalem. We know James, the half-brother of Christ, was married because there's a reference to his wife in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5. He also became known as Camel Knees in the early church because he spent so much time in prayer. He was kneeling all of the time in prayer, and he actually, according to tradition, developed calluses, on his knees. And keep that in mind when he talks about the power of prayer in James chapter 5. He treated people fairly. He was known for, being fair to everyone. And so that's why he took on the nickname James the Just. And then how did James, the half-brother of Christ, die? Well, extra biblically, there's two traditions on it. One is the Hegesippus tradition, which is recorded in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. And it says that Annas, basically, as James is interacting with Annas, in order to avoid stoning, Annas said, look, you've got to go to the top of the wall there in Jerusalem, and you've got to renounce your faith. And he ascended to the top of the Jerusalem walls, and instead of renouncing his faith, he preached the gospel, and the Jewish authorities pushed him off the wall, and he survived the fall, but he was stoned to death. And so one tradition indicates that's how he died. There's a second tradition that comes from the writings of Josephus that Annas ordered James to be stoned to death for violating the law. And Josephus actually records this as one of the reasons why God ultimately sent the Romans to destroy the city and the sanctuary, i.e. Jerusalem, in AD 70. But at any rate, it's fairly well accepted that James, the half-brother of Christ, was indeed one of the early martyrs of Christianity. That's a little bit about his biography.